When three popular students at Clearwater High School decided to corner the quiet new girl in the cafeteria and spit directly in her face. They thought they were just delivering another routine humiliation to someone who wouldn't fight back. What they didn't know was that Emma Rodriguez had just completed 18 months of intensive military training at Camp Pendleton, where she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who choose not to fight until they absolutely have to. The 15 seconds that followed would completely transform the social hierarchy of their school and create a viral moment that would be studied in anti-bullying seminars across the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing anyone noticed about Emma Rodriguez was how easily she seemed to fade into the background. At 17 years old, she possessed the kind of unremarkable presence that made teachers forget her name and classmates look right through her as if she were part of the furniture. Standing just 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build that suggested she might blow away in a strong wind, Emma moved through the hallways of Clearwater High School like a ghost haunting the edges of teenage society. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in the same simple ponytail, never styled with the elaborate braids or colorful highlights that mark other girls as members of various social groups. She wore the standard school uniform without any of the subtle modifications that allowed students to express their individuality within the dress code constraints. No rolled sleeves, no shortened hemlines, no creative accessories that pushed the boundaries of what was technically allowed. When Emma walked between classes, she kept her eyes focused on the ground 3 feet in front of her, a habit that had developed during her first week at Clearwater when she'd learned that making eye contact was often interpreted as either a challenge or an invitation for unwanted attention. Her backpack was always packed with military precision, every item in its designated place, ready for quick access when needed. She carried herself with the careful economy of movement that came from someone who had learned to navigate hostile environments by attracting as little attention as possible. Her sneakers were always clean but worn, suggesting someone who walked everywhere rather than being driven by parents or catching rides with friends. Emma had transferred to Clearwater High School 3 months into the academic year when her family relocated from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to Riverside, California. Her father, Sergeant Major Carlos Rodriguez, had retired from the Marine Corps after 20 years of distinguished service and taken a position as a defense contractor with Pacific Aerospace Systems. The move had been presented as an opportunity for the family to start fresh in a place where Emma could experience normal teenage life without the constant reminders of military culture that had shaped her entire existence. Moving mid-semester was challenging under the best circumstances, but Emma's naturally introverted personality and the social dynamics that had already solidified by January made integration nearly impossible. The academic transition had been relatively smooth. Emma's disciplined study habits and excellent grades from her previous school had earned her placement in advanced courses where she performed consistently well without drawing attention to herself. Her teachers at Clearwater found her to be a model student who completed assignments on time, never disrupted class discussions, and seemed content to blend into the background. Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, her AP history teacher, had noted on Emma's progress report that she was a quiet, conscientious student who would benefit from more class participation. Though she made no particular effort to encourage such participation, Mr. David Kim, her chemistry instructor, appreciated having at least one student who followed laboratory procedures exactly as written and cleaned up her workspace without being reminded. The social aspects of high school life, however, remained completely foreign territory for Emma. She had never learned the complex unwritten rules that governed teenage interactions, the subtle hierarchies that determined who could sit where, during lunch, or the ever-changing fashion trends that marked someone as either acceptably current or hopelessly outdated. Her previous educational experiences had been either on military bases where social structures were clearly defined and explicitly enforced, or in small towns where military families formed their own insular communities. Clearwater High School, with its 2,000 students and intricate web of social relationships, felt like navigating a foreign country without a map or translator. Emma's daily routine had become a carefully planned mission designed to minimize potential conflicts and maximize her chances of completing each day without incident. She arrived at school exactly 15 minutes before the first bell, early enough to avoid the crowds, but not so early as to appear overeager or desperate for social interaction. She had memorized the layout of the school building and identified alternative routes between classrooms that allowed her to avoid the main hallways where popular students congregated. Her locker was located in a less desirable section of the building, but she'd learned to appreciate the relative privacy it provided. During lunch periods, Emma had claimed a corner table near the large windows that overlooked the school's courtyard. The location offered natural light that made her feel less claustrophobic and provided a view of the outside world that sometimes helped her imagine being anywhere else. She always brought her lunch from home, carefully prepared by her mother, Rosa, who seemed to understand that the cafeteria's social dynamics were too complex for her daughter to navigate successfully. Emma would eat methodically, using the time to review notes for afternoon classes or read ahead in her textbooks, creating the appearance of being too busy to be approached by other students. Her free periods were spent in the library, where the enforced quiet and focus on individual study created an environment that felt more comfortable and familiar. Mrs. Patricia Evans, the head librarian, had grown accustomed to Emma's daily presence and had even begun setting aside new books that she thought might interest her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma gravitated toward military history and biographical accounts of women in combat roles, though she was careful to check out other subjects as well to avoid creating any obvious patterns that might invite questions about her interests. Walk between classes required the most careful navigation of her daily routine. Emma had learned to time her movements to avoid peak traffic periods in the hallways, and she'd identified several alcoves and side corridors where she could pause if she sensed trouble approaching. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to detect shifts in the social atmosphere, the way conversations would pause when certain students approached, the subtle changes in body language that indicated someone was being targeted for harassment, the particular quality of laughter that suggested cruelty rather than genuine amusement. What none of her classmates or teachers at Clearwater High School could have imagined was that Emma Rodriguez was probably the most physically capable person in the entire building. Her slight frame and unassuming demeanor concealed someone who had spent the previous 18 months undergoing some of the most rigorous training available to American civilians. When Emma had struggled with severe bullying at her previous school in North Carolina, her father had made a decision that would fundamentally change his daughter's life. Rather than simply moving her to a different school or hoping the problem would resolve itself, Sergeant Major Rodriguez had enrolled Emma in the Young Marines program, an intensive youth development organization that used Marine Corps training methods to build character, discipline, and leadership skills. The Young Marines program had been challenging enough, with its emphasis on physical fitness, military bearing, and leadership development, but Emma's father had arranged for her to participate in an even more intensive summer training program at Camp Pendleton, under the supervision of Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Williams, a decorated Marine veteran who had served multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Emma had undergone training that would have been challenging for adult recruits. The program combined traditional military discipline with practical combat skills, survival training, and advanced physical conditioning. Gunnery Sergeant Williams had been specifically selected as Emma's primary instructor because of her expertise in training female Marines for combat roles. A former drill instructor who had later specialized in hand-to-hand combat training, Williams understood the unique challenges faced by smaller individuals in potentially dangerous situations. She had developed a training philosophy that emphasized using superior technique, timing, and mental preparation to overcome advantages in size and strength. Her approach combined traditional Marine Corps martial arts with elements of jiu-jitsu, boxing, and military combatives, creating a comprehensive system that was both practical and highly effective. Emma's training had begun with basic military conditioning, endless hours of physical exercise designed to build strength, endurance, and mental toughness. She had learned to execute perfect push-ups, pull-ups, and sit-ups while maintaining military bearing even under extreme physical stress. The running requirements had been particularly challenging, with daily distances that gradually increased from 3 miles to 8 miles, often while carrying weighted packs or performing exercises at designated intervals. Her small frame had actually proven advantageous in many aspects of the physical training, allowing her to move with speed and agility that larger recruits couldn't match. The combat training had been even more intensive and comprehensive. Emma had learned to throw punches with proper form and devastating effectiveness, understanding how to generate maximum power from her smaller frame by using proper body mechanics and timing. She had mastered kicks that could disable an opponent regardless of size differential, and she had developed grappling skills that allowed her to control or neutralize much larger opponents. The training had included scenarios specifically designed to prepare her for situations where she might face multiple attackers or opponents with significant size and strength advantages. Perhaps most importantly, Emma had learned a mental discipline that separated trained fighters from people who simply knew how to throw punches. She had developed the ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats quickly and accurately, and to respond with appropriate levels of force depending on the situation. Gunnery Sergeant Williams had repeatedly emphasized that the most dangerous aspect of Emma's training wasn't her physical capabilities, but her mental preparation and decision-making skills under stress. The weapons training had been another crucial component of her education. Emma had learned to handle and maintain various firearms, from standard military rifles to handguns, though this training had been focused primarily on understanding how weapons worked rather than preparing her for actual combat situations. She had also received extensive training in improvised weapons and environmental awareness, learning to identify potential defensive tools in any environment, and understanding how to use common objects as weapons if necessary. The survival training had rounded out her education, teaching her to navigate in unfamiliar terrain, to find food and water in challenging environments, and to maintain her physical and mental health under extreme stress. She had learned basic medical skills that could be crucial in emergency situations, and she had developed a kind of situational awareness that allowed her to assess potential threats and plan appropriate responses almost automatically throughout her training. Emma had been required to maintain detailed journals documenting her progress, her challenges, and her growing understanding of military principles and philosophy. These journals had become a record of her transformation from a frightened, bullied teenager into someone who possessed genuine confidence and capability. She had learned to see herself not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone who could take control of her own situation and protect others who might be vulnerable. The physical transformation had been remarkable but not immediately obvious to casual observers. Emma's slight frame now concealed muscles that had been developed through months of intensive training. Her posture, while still deliberately unassuming, reflected the military bearing she had learned to adopt when necessary. Her hands, which appeared soft and unremarkable, possessed the kind of strength and conditioning that came from thousands of hours of training. Her reflexes had been honed to respond automatically to potential threats, and her balance and coordination had reached levels that would have been impressive even for trained athletes. The mental transformation had been even more significant. Emma had developed the kind of confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges she might face. She had learned to trust her own judgment and capabilities, and she had developed the mental toughness that allowed her to remain calm and focused even under extreme pressure. The bullying she had experienced at her previous school had been transformed from a source of trauma into a learning experience that had ultimately made her stronger and more capable. But perhaps the most important lesson Emma had learned during her training was the philosophy that Gunnery Sergeant Williams had emphasized throughout the program. A true warrior, Williams had repeatedly taught her, doesn't fight because they enjoy violence or because they want to prove how tough they are. A true warrior fights only when fighting is necessary to protect themselves or others who cannot protect themselves. The greatest victory is the one that doesn't require a battle, and the strongest person is often the one who chooses not to use their strength unless they absolutely have to. This philosophy had become the foundation of Emma's approach to her new life at Clearwater High School. She understood that her training gave her options that other students didn't have, but she also understood that using those options inappropriately could have serious consequences for herself and others. She had promised her parents that she would focus on her education and avoid situations that might be misinterpreted as aggression or troublemaking. They had moved to Riverside specifically to give Emma a chance to experience normal teenage life, and she was determined not to disappoint them by reverting to the kind of conflicts that had marked her previous school experience. Emma carried this internal conflict with her every day as she navigated the social complexities of Clearwater High School. She was constantly aware of her capabilities and her training, but she was equally committed to finding peaceful solutions to the challenges she faced. When other students made comments about her clothes or her appearance, she reminded herself that their opinions were ultimately irrelevant and that responding with anger or violence would only create more problems. When she was excluded from social activities or group projects, she told herself that she was at school to learn, not to win popularity contests. The irony of her situation was not lost on Emma. She had spent 18 months learning to be strong, confident, and capable, only to spend her days at Clearwater High School trying to appear weak, vulnerable, and invisible. She had been trained to assess and respond to threats, but she was choosing to ignore the daily harassment and social aggression that had become part of her routine. She possessed skills that could have immediately ended the bullying she experienced, but she was committed to finding other ways to handle her challenges. This internal tension created a constant state of stress that was perhaps more challenging than the actual harassment she faced from other students. Emma found herself lying awake at night, replaying the day's humiliations and imagining how different things might have been if she had responded differently. She would catch herself analyzing the fighting capabilities of students who bothered her, automatically assessing their weaknesses and planning responses that she had no intention of using. Her training had become both a source of confidence and a source of frustration, giving her the knowledge that she could change her situation, while also giving her the wisdom to understand why she shouldn't. The promise she had made to her parents weighed heavily on Emma's mind during these moments of internal conflict. Carlos and Rosa Rodriguez had sacrificed a great deal to provide their daughter with the training she had received, and they had moved their entire family across the country to give her a fresh start. Emma understood that her parents saw her military training as a tool for building confidence and character, not as preparation for actual combat situations. They wanted her to carry herself with dignity and self-respect, but they also wanted her to find peaceful ways to resolve conflicts and build positive relationships with her peers. Emma's older brother, Miguel, who was currently deployed with the Marines in the Middle East, had been another important influence on her thinking about how to handle her situation at Clearwater High School. During their regular video calls, Miguel had reinforced the lesson she had learned from Gunnery Sergeant Williams about choosing battles wisely and using strength responsibly. The hardest thing about being strong, he had told her during one of their conversations, is knowing when not to use that strength. Anyone can throw a punch, but it takes real courage to walk away from a fight when you know you could win it. These conversations with Miguel had helped Emma understand that her current situation was actually another form of training, an opportunity to practice the mental discipline and emotional control that were just as important as physical capabilities. She began to see her daily challenges at Clearwater High School not as failures or weaknesses, but as tests of her character and her commitment to the principles she had learned during her military training. Emma's daily existence at Clearwater High School had become a carefully orchestrated dance of avoidance and endurance, where every movement was calculated to minimize contact with the 3 students who had appointed themselves as her primary tormentors. The leadership of this unofficial harassment campaign belonged to Ashley Parker, a 17-year-old who wielded social power with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a battlefield commander. Ashley stood 5 feet 7 inches, tall with platinum blonde hair that always appeared perfectly styled, as if she had stepped directly from a magazine photo shoot into the hallways of their suburban California high school. Ashley's confidence emanated from every aspect of her appearance and demeanor. She wore the standard school uniform with subtle modifications that somehow made her look like she was wearing designer clothing rather than the same navy blazer and khaki skirt required of all female students. Her shoes were always the most expensive version allowed by the dress code, and her accessories were carefully chosen to suggest wealth and status without technically violating any rules. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who had never been challenged or contradicted, someone who expected the world to rearrange itself according to her preferences and had rarely been disappointed in that expectation. The source of Ashley's social dominance at Clearwater High School was multifaceted and deeply entrenched in the power structures that governed teenage society. Her father, Richard Parker, owned Parker Premium Automotive, the largest luxury car dealership in Riverside County, with satellite locations extending throughout Southern California. The Parker family's wealth was not merely substantial but ostentatious, displayed through their sprawling estate in the exclusive Hillcrest neighborhood, their collection of exotic vehicles, and their regular appearances at charity galas and political fundraisers that were covered by the local society pages. Ashley had grown up understanding that money translated directly into influence, and that influence could be used to control other people's lives. Beyond her family's financial resources, Ashley had cultivated her own sources of power within the school's social ecosystem. She served as student body vice president, a position she had won not through popular appeal but through a combination of strategic campaign management and her ability to convince other students that supporting her candidacy was in their best interests. Her campaign had been notable for its professional quality, with glossy materials and sophisticated messaging that reflected her family's connections to local political consultants and marketing professionals. During her tenure in student government, Ashley had demonstrated a remarkable ability to identify and exploit the weaknesses in school policies and administrative procedures, using her position to benefit herself and her allies while maintaining plausible deniability about her motivations. Ashley's role as captain of the cheerleading squad provided her with another avenue for exercising control over her peers. The Clearwater High School cheerleading program was highly competitive and socially prestigious, with tryouts that were notoriously difficult and selection criteria that seemed to favor students from wealthy families who could afford private coaching and expensive uniforms. Ashley had been involved in cheerleading since elementary school, progressing through increasingly elite programs that had taught her not only athletic skills but also the complex social dynamics that governed team relationships. Her leadership style as captain was characterized by a combination of inspiration and intimidation. motivating her squad members to achieve excellence while making it clear that failure to meet her standards would result in social ostracism and removal from the team. The third pillar of Ashley's power was her carefully cultivated relationship with the adult authority figures at Clearwater High School. She had mastered the art of presenting herself as a model student and responsible leader, while concealing the more manipulative aspects of her personality. Teachers and administrators saw Ashley as articulate, well-prepared, and respectful, someone who could be counted on to represent the school positively in public settings. Her academic performance was consistently strong, though not exceptional, maintained through a combination of genuine intelligence and strategic choices about which classes to prioritize. She had developed particularly close relationships with several faculty members, who served as sponsors for various student organizations, relationships that provided her with advance knowledge of administrative decisions and the ability to influence policy discussions. Ashley's approach to social dominance was sophisticated and methodical, reflecting lessons learned from observing her father's business practices and her mother's involvement in local political campaigns. She understood that direct confrontation was often less effective than subtle manipulation, and she had developed an arsenal of techniques for controlling other students without leaving obvious evidence of her interference. Her methods included strategic spreading of rumors and gossip, selective inclusion and exclusion from social events, and the use of her various leadership positions to create opportunities for rewarding allies and punishing enemies. The psychological foundation of Ashley's behavior toward Emma Rodriguez was rooted in her fundamental belief that social hierarchies were natural and necessary, and that people who failed to understand their place in these hierarchies needed to be educated through direct experience. In Ashley's worldview, Emma's quiet demeanor and apparent lack of social connections marked her as someone who belonged at the bottom of the social order, and Emma's failure to acknowledge this reality represented a form of disrespect that required correction. Ashley genuinely believed that she was providing Emma with valuable lessons about how the world worked, and she was frustrated by Emma's apparent inability to learn from these educational experiences. Ashley's primary lieutenant in her campaign against Emma was Jake Morrison, an 18-year-old linebacker who had been held back a year due to academic difficulties and had channeled his frustration about this setback into increasingly aggressive behavior toward students he perceived as vulnerable. Jake stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds, with the kind of imposing physical presence that had been developed through years of intensive football training and weightlifting. His size alone was often sufficient to intimidate other students, but Jake had also cultivated a reputation for unpredictability and barely controlled anger that made even larger students reluctant to challenge him directly. Jake's academic struggles had been a source of ongoing embarrassment and frustration throughout his high school career. Despite his intelligence in practical matters and his natural leadership abilities on the football field, he had never developed effective study skills or learned to manage the organizational demands of high school coursework. His teachers generally liked him personally and recognized his potential, but they had grown frustrated with his inconsistent performance and his tendency to become defensive when confronted about missing assignments or poor test scores. The decision to hold him back had been presented as an opportunity for academic improvement, but Jake had experienced it as a public humiliation that confirmed his worst fears about his own intelligence and capabilities. The football program at Clearwater High School had provided Jake with his primary source of identity and self-worth, and his success on the field had partially compensated for his academic struggles. As a linebacker, Jake had earned recognition for his aggressive playing style and his ability to intimidate opposing players through both his physical presence and his reputation for delivering punishing hits. His coaches appreciated his work ethic and his loyalty to the team, though they had occasionally had to address his tendency to take unnecessary risks or engage in unsportsmanlike conduct when he felt disrespected by opponents or officials. Jake's relationship with Ashley Parker had developed through their shared involvement in the school's most prestigious social circles, though their connection was based more on mutual utility than genuine friendship. Ashley recognized Jake's value as an enforcer who could provide physical intimidation when her more subtle methods of social control proved insufficient. Jake, in turn, appreciated Ashley's ability to provide him with social status and protection from the academic and disciplinary consequences of his behavior. Their partnership was symbiotic, with each providing the other with resources and capabilities that they lacked individually. Jake's approach to intimidation was generally straightforward and physical, relying on his size and strength to create fear and compliance in his targets. He had developed a repertoire of techniques for making other students uncomfortable without technically violating school policies about physical contact or verbal harassment. These methods included standing too close to people during conversations, using his body to block doorways or hallways, and making comments that were ambiguous enough to avoid disciplinary action, but clear enough to convey threats. His reputation for unpredictability was carefully cultivated, based on a few well-publicized incidents where he had responded to perceived disrespect with sudden and overwhelming aggression. The third member of Ashley's inner circle was Madison Chun, a junior who had perfected the art of psychological warfare through social manipulation and strategic information management. Madison was petite and delicate in appearance, with features that suggested innocence and vulnerability, but she possessed one of the most calculating and strategic minds in the school. Her academic performance was exceptional, with a perfect grade point average and impressive standardized test scores that had already attracted attention from elite universities. Madison served as student council secretary and was involved in numerous honor societies and academic clubs, positions that provided her with access to information and influence that she used to advance her own interests and those of her allies. Madison's family background was markedly different from Ashley's, reflecting the diversity of paths that could lead to social power in the complex ecosystem of Clearwater High School. Her parents were both professionals who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1990s and had built successful careers in technology and finance through a combination of exceptional academic credentials and relentless work ethic. The Chun family's wealth was substantial but more recently acquired than the Parker family's generational affluence, and Madison had learned to navigate the subtle distinctions between different types of social status and privilege. Madison's approach to social dominance was characterized by patience, planning, and precision. She understood that information was power, and she had developed an extensive network of sources throughout the school that provided her with advanced knowledge of academic policies, social developments, and personal conflicts. Her ability to gather, analyze, and strategically deploy this information made her an invaluable ally and a dangerous enemy. Madison's methods were subtle and often invisible to casual observers, but they were devastatingly effective in their ability to shape social dynamics and influence individual behavior. The psychological motivation behind Madison's participation in the harassment of Emma Rodriguez was more complex than Ashley's straightforward belief in social hierarchies or Jake's need to compensate for academic frustrations. Madison was driven by a perfectionist personality and an obsessive need to control her environment, characteristics that had served her well academically, but had also created a deep anxiety about unpredictability and change. Emma's presence at Clearwater High School represented an unknown variable that Madison felt compelled to understand and control, and Emma's refusal to conform to expected social patterns created a sense of disorder that Madison found genuinely distressing. Madison's contributions to the harassment campaign were typically indirect and sophisticated, focusing on long-term psychological pressure rather than immediate confrontation. She had developed expertise in using social media and digital communication, to spread rumors and manipulate social dynamics, creating networks of information and influence that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the school. Her academic achievements and reputation for integrity provided her with credibility that made her rumors and accusations particularly damaging, as other students and even some adults were inclined to trust her assessments of social situations. The collaboration between Ashley, Jake, and Madison created a formidable alliance that combined different types of power and influence to create a comprehensive system of social control. Ashley provided leadership, resources, and institutional connections. Jake provided physical intimidation and the threat of violence. Madison provided intelligence, strategic planning, and the ability to manipulate information flows. Together, they had established themselves as the unofficial enforcers of social order at Clearwater High School, with the power to elevate or destroy the reputations and social standing of their classmates. Their initial assessment of Emma Rodriguez as a potential target had been based on several factors that suggested she would be an easy victim who would submit to their authority without significant resistance. Emma's obvious status as a newcomer to the school marked her as someone without established social connections or institutional protection. Her quiet demeanor and apparent shyness suggested someone who would be unlikely to fight back or seek help from authority figures. Her family's military background, while potentially suggesting discipline and strength, was interpreted by Ashley's group as evidence of rigidity and social awkwardness that would make integration into civilian teenage society difficult. The three students had developed their harassment campaign against Emma gradually, testing her responses and escalating their tactics based on her apparent inability or unwillingness to resist their pressure. Their initial approaches had been relatively subtle, designed to establish dominance without creating obvious evidence of bullying that might attract administrative attention. These early tactics had included strategic exclusion from social activities, subtle comments about Emma's appearance and background, and the kind of small-scale social manipulation that was common in high school environments, but difficult for adults to recognize or address. Ashley had taken the lead in developing the overall strategy for their campaign against Emma, drawing on her experience in student government and her understanding of institutional dynamics to create a plan that would be effective while minimizing the risk of serious consequences for herself and her allies. The plan involved gradually escalating pressure through a combination of social isolation, psychological intimidation, and strategic humiliation, with the ultimate goal of convincing Emma to either conform to their expectations or remove herself from situations where she might challenge their authority. Jake's role in the campaign was primarily focused on providing physical intimidation and the implicit threat of violence that would prevent Emma from seeking help or fighting back. His contributions included positioning himself in ways that would make Emma feel trapped or vulnerable, using his size and strength to create discomfort during routine interactions, and making comments that suggested potential physical consequences for resistance. Jake's reputation for unpredictability and his history of aggressive behavior made these threats particularly effective, as Emma had no way of knowing whether his intimidation was merely psychological or might escalate to actual violence. Madison's responsibilities centered on information gathering and strategic communication, using her academic reputation and social connections to spread rumors about Emma and to monitor Emma's responses to their pressure. Madison had developed detailed profiles of Emma's daily routines, academic performance, and social interactions, information that was used to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities for psychological pressure. Her ability to present herself as a concerned and trustworthy student allowed her to gather information from teachers, administrators, and other students who were unaware of her true motivations. The effectiveness of their collaboration was demonstrated by their ability to maintain their campaign against Emma for months without attracting significant attention from school authorities or generating sympathy for Emma among other students. Their tactics were carefully calibrated to remain below the threshold of obvious bullying while still creating substantial psychological pressure and social isolation for their target. They had successfully created an environment where Emma's daily existence at Clearwater High School was characterized by constant stress, anxiety, and humiliation. The psychological impact of their campaign on Emma had been substantial, though not in the ways that Ashley, Jake, and Madison had anticipated. Rather than breaking Emma's spirit or convincing her to submit to their authority, their harassment had created a state of constant internal conflict between Emma's military training and her commitment to finding peaceful solutions to her challenges. The pressure they applied had actually strengthened Emma's resolve and sharpened her analytical skills, as she found herself automatically assessing their tactics and developing potential responses that she had no intention of implementing. Emma's military training had taught her to recognize and analyze different types of threats, and she had quickly identified the distinct roles that each member of Ashley's group played in their coordinated campaign against her. She understood that Ashley was the strategic leader who provided direction and resources, that Jake was the physical enforcer who provided intimidation and the threat of violence, and that Madison was the intelligence operative who gathered information and managed communication. This understanding allowed Emma to predict their behavior and plan her own responses, though she remained committed to avoiding confrontation whenever possible. The irony of the situation was that Ashley, Jake, and Madison had unknowingly chosen to target someone who was far more dangerous than they could have imagined, someone whose training and capabilities made their intimidation tactics not just ineffective, but potentially counterproductive. Emma's military conditioning had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to analyze threats objectively, and to respond with appropriate force when necessary. The harassment campaign that was designed to break her spirit was actually providing her with valuable practice in applying the psychological training she had received during her military preparation. As the months passed and their campaign against Emma continued, the three students began to develop a false sense of confidence about their ability to control and manipulate their target. Emma's apparent passivity and her consistent pattern of avoiding confrontation convinced them that their tactics were working and that she was gradually being worn down by their pressure. They interpreted her quiet demeanor and her tendency to withdraw from social situations as evidence that she was accepting her place in the social hierarchy they were trying to establish. This misinterpretation of Emma's behavior would prove to be a critical error in judgment that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Ashley, Jake, and Madison had developed their assessment of Emma based on surface observations and conventional assumptions about how victims of bullying typically respond to pressure. They had failed to recognize the signs of military training and discipline that were evident in Emma's posture, her situational awareness, and her systematic approach to managing the challenges she faced. Their failure to accurately assess their target would soon have consequences that none of them had anticipated or prepared for. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose the fundamental flaws in their understanding of power, intimidation, and social control. Emma's patience and restraint, which they had interpreted as weakness, was actually the calm before a storm that would completely transform the social dynamics of Clearwater High School and teach them lessons about the difference between genuine strength and the illusion of power created by social privilege and institutional protection. The institutional environment at Clearwater High School had evolved into a complex ecosystem where systematic harassment could flourish unchecked, protected by layers of administrative indifference, faculty overwhelm, and a pervasive culture that prioritized reputation management over student welfare. The adult authority figures who should have served as protectors and advocates for vulnerable students had instead become unwitting enablers of the very behaviors they were supposedly committed to preventing. This failure of institutional responsibility created the perfect conditions for students like Ashley, Jake, and Madison to operate with virtual impunity while their victims suffered in silence. Principal Robert Thompson embodied the institutional priorities that had allowed bullying to become endemic at Clearwater High School. At 54 years old, Thompson had spent the last 8 years in his current position after serving as an assistant principal at 2 other schools in the district. His educational background included a master's degree in educational administration and numerous professional development courses focused on budget management, standardized testing, and liability reduction. Thompson's approach to school leadership was heavily influenced by his previous experience in corporate management, where he had learned to prioritize measurable outcomes and risk mitigation over less quantifiable concerns like student emotional welfare or social dynamics. Thompson's office occupied a corner of the administrative wing with large windows that overlooked the student parking lot, a vantage point that he felt gave him insight into the daily rhythms of school life. The walls were decorated with framed certificates documenting his various administrative credentials, photographs from district recognition ceremonies, and motivational posters featuring generic inspirational messages about leadership and excellence. His desk was meticulously organized with color-coded filing systems and digital displays, showing real-time data about attendance rates, test scores, and budget expenditures. The overall impression was of someone who approached education as a technical problem that could be solved through proper data analysis and efficient resource allocation. Thompson's daily routine reflected his priorities and management philosophy. His mornings were typically devoted to reviewing overnight incident reports, analyzing attendance and disciplinary statistics, and preparing for meetings with district administrators or school board members. He spent considerable time managing the school's public image, coordinating with the communications department to ensure that any negative incidents were properly contextualized and that positive achievements received appropriate publicity. His interactions with students were generally limited to formal ceremonies, disciplinary hearings for serious infractions, and carefully orchestrated public relations opportunities. The principal's approach to discipline and student behavior management was heavily influenced by district policies that emphasized documentation, due process, and legal liability reduction. Thompson had learned through experience that aggressive intervention in student conflicts often created more problems than it solved, particularly when dealing with influential families who had the resources and connections to challenge administrative decisions. His preference was for handling most issues through existing bureaucratic channels, relying on teachers and counselors to address problems at the classroom level before they required administrative intervention. Thompson's relationship with the school's most prominent families, including the Parkers, was characterized by careful diplomatic balance. He understood that these families provided significant financial and political support for the school through their involvement in booster clubs, fundraising committees, and local politics. Richard Parker's automotive dealership was a major sponsor of the school's athletic programs, and the Parker family's charitable foundation had funded several significant facility improvements over the past decade. Thompson was acutely aware that alienating influential families could have serious consequences for his career and for the school's financial resources. This awareness created a complex dynamic where Thompson was naturally inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to students from prominent families while being more skeptical of complaints from students whose families lacked similar influence or resources. The bias was not necessarily conscious or intentional, but it was reflected in the patterns of how different types of incidents were investigated and resolved. Students like Ashley Parker rarely faced serious consequences for their behavior, while students from less influential backgrounds often found themselves subjected to more intensive scrutiny and harsher punishments for similar infractions. Thompson's understanding of bullying was largely theoretical, based on district training sessions and educational literature, rather than direct experience or deep psychological insight. He tended to conceptualize bullying as a series of discrete incidents that could be addressed through specific interventions rather than understanding it as a complex social phenomenon involving systems of power, influence, and institutional dynamics. His approach to investigating bullying complaints was heavily focused on gathering documentation and witness statements that could support formal disciplinary action, but he had little appreciation for the subtle forms of psychological harassment that characterized most modern bullying campaigns. The vice principal, Mrs. Sarah Davis, represented another layer of institutional dysfunction that enabled systematic harassment to continue unchallenged. Davis had been promoted to her current position after 15 years as a classroom teacher and counselor, and she brought to her administrative role a combination of genuine concern for student welfare and complete overwhelm with the practical demands of managing disciplinary issues at a school with over 2,000 students. Her daily schedule was packed with crisis management, from drug possession incidents to academic cheating scandals to family emergencies that required immediate administrative response. Davis's office was located adjacent to the main administrative area, and it served as a constant hub of activity as students, parents, teachers, and support staff sought her attention for various urgent matters. The walls were covered with schedules, policy reminders, and emergency contact information, while her desk was perpetually buried under stacks of incident reports, academic appeals, and disciplinary correspondence. The overall atmosphere was one of controlled chaos, where every problem was treated as an emergency and long-term strategic thinking was nearly impossible. The vice principal's approach to student discipline was shaped by her background in counseling and her belief that most behavioral problems could be resolved through communication and conflict resolution rather than punitive measures. Davis genuinely cared about student welfare and often went above and beyond her official responsibilities to help students navigate personal and academic challenges. However, her heavy caseload and the constant pressure of crisis management meant that she rarely had the time or resources to investigate complex social dynamics or address subtle forms of harassment that didn't result in obvious violations of school policy. Davis had developed a system for triaging disciplinary issues based on their apparent severity and the likelihood that they would escalate into more serious problems. Physical altercations, drug possession, and academic dishonesty received immediate attention, while complaints about social conflicts, verbal harassment, and exclusionary behavior were often relegated to lower priority status. This system was designed to maximize efficiency and ensure that the most serious threats to school safety and order were addressed promptly. But it also meant that many forms of bullying were effectively ignored until they escalated into more obvious violations. The faculty at Clearwater High School represented a diverse group of dedicated educators who were generally committed to their students' success but were operating within institutional constraints that limited their ability to address social and behavioral issues effectively. Most teachers were overwhelmed with the demands of curriculum delivery, standardized test preparation, and administrative compliance, leaving little time or energy for monitoring and addressing complex interpersonal dynamics among their students. The pressure to maintain high academic achievement and meet district performance standards meant that classroom management focused primarily on maintaining order and minimizing disruptions rather than fostering positive social relationships or addressing underlying conflicts. Mrs. Rebecca Foster, Emma's English teacher, exemplified the well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective approach that characterized much of the faculty's response to student social issues. Foster had been teaching for 12 years and had developed a reputation as a knowledgeable and caring educator who maintained high academic standards while genuinely supporting her students' intellectual and personal development. Her classroom was decorated with literary quotes and student artwork, and she made a conscious effort to create an inclusive environment where all students felt valued and respected. However, Foster's understanding of classroom dynamics was limited by her focus on academic content and her tendency to interpret social conflicts as temporary disruptions rather than systematic patterns of harassment. When she observed students like Ashley making subtle comments about Emma's appearance or academic contributions, Foster generally addressed these incidents as minor disciplinary issues rather than recognizing them as components of a larger campaign of psychological intimidation. Her interventions typically involved brief conversations with individual students or general reminders about respectful behavior, approaches that were insufficient to address the sophisticated and coordinated nature of the harassment Emma was experiencing. Coach Michael Stevens, who oversaw the athletic programs and had significant influence over students like Jake Morrison, represented another aspect of the institutional failure to address bullying effectively. Stevens had been coaching at Clearwater High School for over 20 years and had built the football program into one of the most successful in the region. His coaching philosophy emphasized discipline, teamwork, and competitive excellence, and he had developed strong relationships with many of his players based on mutual respect and shared commitment to athletic achievement. Stevens's approach to managing student behavior was heavily influenced by his military background and his belief that clear expectations and consistent consequences were the most effective tools for shaping character and performance within the structured environment of athletic practice and competition. This approach was generally successful in maintaining order and motivating students to achieve their potential. However, Stevens had limited insight into how his players behaved outside of the athletic context, and he tended to dismiss reports of inappropriate behavior as either exaggerated complaints or isolated incidents that didn't reflect his players' true character. The coach's relationship with Jake Morrison was complicated by Jake's value to the football program and Stevens's belief that athletic participation was ultimately beneficial for students who might otherwise struggle with academic or behavioral issues. Stevens was aware that Jake had academic challenges and occasional disciplinary problems, but he viewed these issues as symptoms of underlying potential that could be developed through proper guidance and structure. The coach's protective attitude toward his players often translated into skepticism about complaints from students who weren't involved in athletics, particularly when those complaints might result in suspensions or other consequences that would affect team performance. The school counseling staff, led by Ms. Patricia Martinez, represented perhaps the most significant missed opportunity for addressing the systematic harassment that Emma and other students experienced at Clearwater High School. Martinez had extensive training in adolescent psychology and crisis intervention, and she possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical skills necessary to identify and address complex patterns of student social conflict. Her office was designed to be a safe and welcoming space where students could discuss personal challenges without fear of judgment or immediate consequences. However, Martinez's effectiveness was severely limited by her overwhelming caseload and the institutional pressures that prioritized college preparation and crisis intervention over preventive social-emotional support. With over 500 students assigned to her direct supervision, Martinez spent most of her time managing academic planning, college applications, and immediate mental health crises. Her schedule was typically booked weeks in advance with mandatory meetings about graduation requirements, standardized testing, and post-secondary planning, leaving little time for the kind of ongoing relationship building and social dynamic monitoring that would be necessary to identify and address subtle forms of harassment. Martinez had developed efficient systems for managing the most urgent aspects of her responsibilities, but these systems were not well suited to addressing complex social issues that developed gradually over time. Students who were experiencing bullying or harassment were expected to self-report their problems and request specific interventions, but many victims of systematic harassment were reluctant to seek help due to fear of retaliation, shame about their situation, or skepticism about whether adults would be able to provide effective assistance. The broader faculty culture at Clearwater High School had evolved in ways that inadvertently discouraged intervention in student social conflicts. Teachers were evaluated primarily based on their students' academic performance and their ability to maintain classroom order, with little consideration given to their effectiveness in fostering positive social relationships or addressing interpersonal conflicts. Professional development focused almost exclusively on curriculum delivery and instructional techniques, with minimal training provided about recognizing and responding to different forms of student harassment or social exclusion. Many teachers had learned through experience that intervening in student social conflicts often created more problems than it solved, particularly when dealing with sophisticated students who were skilled at manipulating adult perceptions and avoiding obvious policy violations. The time and energy required to investigate and address complex social dynamics were difficult to justify when teachers were already struggling to meet their primary academic responsibilities. The result was a culture where most faculty members had learned to avoid involvement in student social issues unless those issues directly disrupted their classroom instruction or violated clear and obvious school policies. The student body at Clearwater High School had developed their own complex social ecosystem that both reflected and reinforced the institutional dynamics that enabled systematic harassment. The school's size and diversity created numerous opportunities for social stratification and conflict, while the competitive academic and social environment encouraged students to focus on their own advancement rather than supporting their peers. The result was a social atmosphere where most students were either actively participating in exclusionary behavior or passively enabling it through their unwillingness to intervene on behalf of victims. The bystander effect was particularly pronounced among students who might otherwise have been sympathetic to Emma's situation. Many students recognized that the harassment she was experiencing was unfair and inappropriate, but they also understood that challenging Ashley's group would likely result in their own social ostracism or targeting for similar treatment. The social costs of intervention seemed to outweigh the potential benefits, particularly for students who were themselves vulnerable to harassment or who lacked the social status necessary to effectively challenge established power dynamics. The few students who might have been willing to intervene on Emma's behalf were often deterred by the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign and the difficulty of identifying specific incidents that clearly violated school policies. Ashley, Jake, and Madison had become expert at operating within the gray areas of acceptable behavior, creating situations where their victims were obviously suffering but where adult observers might struggle to identify concrete policy violations that would justify disciplinary action. This ambiguity made it difficult for potential allies to know how to help or what specific actions they could take that would be effective rather than counterproductive. The technology and social media landscape had created additional challenges for addressing systematic harassment at Clearwater High School. Much of the psychological warfare that students like Madison conducted occurred through digital platforms that were difficult for school authorities to monitor or regulate. Students could create private group chats, anonymous social media accounts, and other digital spaces where harassment could continue around the clock without direct oversight. When she observed students like Ashley making subtle comments about Emma's appearance or academic contributions, Foster generally addressed these incidents as minor disciplinary issues rather than recognizing them as components of a larger campaign of psychological intimidation. Her interventions typically involved brief conversations with individual students or general reminders about respectful behavior, approaches that were insufficient to address the sophisticated and coordinated nature of the harassment Emma was experiencing. Coach Michael Stevens, who oversaw the athletic programs and had significant influence over students like Jake Morrison, represented another aspect of the institutional failure to address bullying effectively. Stevens had been coaching at Clearwater High School for over 20 years and had built the football program into one of the most successful in the region. His coaching philosophy emphasized discipline, teamwork, and competitive excellence, and he had developed strong relationships with many of his players based on mutual respect and shared commitment to athletic achievement. Stevens's approach to managing student behavior was heavily influenced by his military background and his belief that clear expectations and consistent consequences were the most effective tools for shaping character and performance within the structured environment of athletic practice and competition. This approach was generally successful in maintaining order and motivating students to achieve their potential. However, Stevens had limited insight into how his players behaved outside of the athletic context, and he tended to dismiss reports of inappropriate behavior as either exaggerated complaints or isolated incidents that didn't reflect his players' true character. The coach's relationship with Jake Morrison was complicated by Jake's value to the football program and Stevens's belief that athletic participation was ultimately beneficial for students who might otherwise struggle with academic or behavioral issues. Stevens was aware that Jake had academic challenges and occasional disciplinary problems, but he viewed these issues as symptoms of underlying potential that could be developed through proper guidance and structure. The coach's protective attitude toward his players often translated into skepticism about complaints from students who weren't involved in athletics, particularly when those complaints might result in suspensions or other consequences that would affect team performance. The school counseling staff, led by Ms. Patricia Martinez, represented perhaps the most significant missed opportunity for addressing the systematic harassment that Emma and other students experienced at Clearwater High School. Martinez had extensive training in adolescent psychology and crisis intervention, and she possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical skills necessary to identify and address complex patterns of student social conflict. Her office was designed to be a safe and welcoming space where students could discuss personal challenges without fear of judgment or immediate consequences. However, Martinez's effectiveness was severely limited by her overwhelming caseload and the institutional pressures that prioritized college preparation and crisis intervention over preventive social-emotional support. With over 500 students assigned to her direct supervision, Martinez spent most of her time managing academic planning, college applications, and immediate mental health crises. Her schedule was typically booked weeks in advance with mandatory meetings about graduation requirements, standardized testing, and post-secondary planning, leaving little time for the kind of ongoing relationship building and social dynamic monitoring that would be necessary to identify and address subtle forms of harassment. Martinez had developed efficient systems for managing the most urgent aspects of her responsibilities, but these systems were not well suited to addressing complex social issues that developed gradually over time. Students who were experiencing bullying or harassment were expected to self-report their problems and request specific interventions, but many victims of systematic harassment were reluctant to seek help due to fear of retaliation, shame about their situation, or skepticism about whether adults would be able to provide effective assistance. The broader faculty culture at Clearwater High School had evolved in ways that inadvertently discouraged intervention in student social conflicts. Teachers were evaluated primarily based on their students' academic performance and their ability to maintain classroom order, with little consideration given to their effectiveness in fostering positive social relationships or addressing interpersonal conflicts. Professional development focused almost exclusively on curriculum delivery and instructional techniques, with minimal training provided about recognizing and responding to different forms of student harassment or social exclusion. Many teachers had learned through experience that intervening in student social conflicts often created more problems than it solved, particularly when dealing with sophisticated students who were skilled at manipulating adult perceptions and avoiding obvious policy violations. The time and energy required to investigate and address complex social dynamics were difficult to justify, when teachers were already struggling to meet their primary academic responsibilities. The result was a culture where most faculty members had learned to avoid involvement in student social issues unless those issues directly disrupted their classroom instruction or violated clear and obvious school policies. The student body at Clearwater High School had developed their own complex social ecosystem that both reflected and reinforced the institutional dynamics that enabled systematic harassment. The school's size and diversity created numerous opportunities for social stratification and conflict, while the competitive academic and social environment encouraged students to focus on their own advancement rather than supporting their peers. The result was a social atmosphere where most students were either actively participating in exclusionary behavior or passively enabling it through their unwillingness to intervene on behalf of victims. The bystander effect was particularly pronounced among students who might otherwise have been sympathetic to Emma's situation. Many students recognized that the harassment she was experiencing was unfair and inappropriate, but they also understood that challenging Ashley's group would likely result in their own social ostracism or targeting for similar treatment. The social costs of intervention seemed to outweigh the potential benefits, particularly for students who were themselves vulnerable to harassment or who lacked the social status necessary to effectively challenge established power dynamics. The few students who might have been willing to intervene on Emma's behalf were often deterred by the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign and the difficulty of identifying specific incidents that clearly violated school policies. Ashley, Jake, and Madison had become expert at operating within the gray areas of acceptable behavior, creating situations where their victims were obviously suffering but where adult observers might struggle to identify concrete policy violations that would justify disciplinary action. This ambiguity made it difficult for potential allies to know how to help or what specific actions they could take that would be effective rather than counterproductive. The technology and social media landscape had created additional challenges for addressing systematic harassment at Clearwater High School. Much of the psychological warfare that students like Madison conducted occurred through digital platforms that were difficult for school authorities to monitor or regulate. Students could create private group chats, anonymous social media accounts, and other digital spaces where harassment could continue around the clock without direct oversight. Her textbooks had been subjected to various forms of minor damage, including torn pages, stained covers, and missing sections that made studying more difficult without creating obvious proof of vandalism. Her personal belongings had been moved, hidden, or damaged in ways that created constant stress and uncertainty without providing clear evidence of who was responsible. Jake's contributions during this phase had included more direct physical intimidation and the creation of situations where Emma felt genuinely threatened and unsafe. He had begun following Emma between classes, maintaining a distance that was technically appropriate, but close enough to create a sense of constant surveillance and potential danger. He had also started making comments about Emma's family background and military connections, suggesting that her father's service record might include controversial or embarrassing incidents that would become public knowledge if Emma continued to draw attention to herself. The psychological impact of this sustained campaign had been substantial and cumulative, creating a state of chronic stress and hypervigilance that affected every aspect of Emma's daily life at Clearwater High School. Her academic performance, while still technically satisfactory, had begun to show signs of strain as she struggled to concentrate on coursework while constantly monitoring her environment for potential threats. Her sleep patterns had been disrupted by recurring anxiety dreams, and her appetite had decreased as stress hormones affected her digestive system. Most significantly, her military training had begun to assert itself more forcefully as her body and mind recognized the systematic nature of the threats she was facing. Emma's internal conflict during this period had intensified to nearly unbearable levels as her conditioning and instincts warred with her conscious commitment to peaceful resolution. Her training at Camp Pendleton had taught her to recognize and analyze different types of threats, and she had quickly identified the coordinated nature of the campaign against her. Her military education had provided her with detailed knowledge about psychological warfare tactics, and she could see clearly how Ashley's group was using textbook strategies of isolation, intimidation, and gradual escalation to break down her resistance and force her submission. The most challenging aspect of Emma's situation was her growing recognition that her restraint was being interpreted as weakness by her tormentors, encouraging them to escalate their tactics in search of the breaking point that would force her to either submit completely or fight back. Her military training had taught her that strategic withdrawal was sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force, but it had also taught her that enemies who interpreted withdrawal as defeat would inevitably escalate their aggression until decisive action became unavoidable. Emma's nightly phone conversations with her brother Miguel had become increasingly difficult as she struggled to maintain the fiction that her adjustment to Clearwater High School was proceeding smoothly. Miguel's own combat experience had given him insights into psychological pressure and stress responses that made it difficult to completely conceal her situation from him. But Emma was determined to avoid worrying her family or creating pressure for them to intervene on her behalf. She understood that any direct involvement from her parents or brother would likely escalate the conflict in ways that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The breaking point had been approaching inevitably as the campaign against Emma entered its fourth month, and Ashley's group had begun to show signs of frustration with their inability to achieve the complete submission they had expected. Their tactics had become more aggressive and less subtle as they searched for the trigger that would finally break Emma's resistance and establish their dominance conclusively. Ashley had begun making comments about Emma's family that crossed clear lines of appropriateness, suggesting that military families were inherently dysfunctional and that Emma's problems were symptoms of larger issues with her background and upbringing. Madison's contributions had become more personal and vindictive, focusing on Emma's relationship with her deployed brother and suggesting that his military service was either fabricated or involved activities that brought shame to the family. These attacks on Miguel had been particularly difficult for Emma to tolerate, as they represented an escalation from harassment of Emma herself to attacks on someone she loved who was serving their country in dangerous circumstances. Madison's academic reputation and apparent sincerity made these rumors particularly damaging, as other students and even some adults were inclined to trust her assessments and repeat her claims without verification. Jake's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable and threatening as his frustration with Emma's continued resistance had grown. His physical intimidation tactics had escalated to include blocking Emma's path between classes, forcing her to ask permission to pass while he evaluated whether to grant or deny her requests. He had also begun making comments about Emma's appearance and physical capabilities that were explicitly sexual and threatening, suggesting that her vulnerability and isolation made her an attractive target for various forms of exploitation. The final week before the confrontation had been marked by a series of incidents that had pushed Emma's self-control to its absolute limits while still falling just short of the clear policy violations that would have justified administrative intervention. Ashley had orchestrated a campaign of social media harassment that had extended the psychological pressure beyond school hours, creating fake accounts that sent Emma disturbing messages and posted embarrassing photographs taken without her knowledge or consent. Madison had contributed technical expertise that made it difficult to trace these accounts back to their creators, while also using her academic connections to spread rumors about Emma's mental health and stability among faculty members. Jake's behavior during this final week had included following Emma to and from school, creating a sense of constant surveillance that extended beyond the boundaries of the campus. He had also begun making comments about Emma's family's living situation and daily routines, suggesting that he had been conducting surveillance of their home and personal activities. These comments had been particularly disturbing because they implied that the harassment campaign might extend to threats against Emma's parents and potentially interfere with her father's new employment situation. The cumulative effect of these escalating tactics had created a situation where Emma was spending virtually all of her mental and emotional energy on managing the constant stress and threat assessment required to navigate each school day safely. Her academic performance had begun to suffer noticeably as concentration became increasingly difficult, and her physical health had shown signs of strain from chronic stress and hypervigilance. Most critically, her military training had begun to override her conscious decision-making processes as her body and mind recognized that the threat level had reached a point where passive resistance was no longer an effective strategy. The specific incident that would finally trigger Emma's transformation had been planned by Ashley as the culminating moment of their campaign, designed to deliver maximum humiliation while demonstrating their complete dominance over their target. Ashley had chosen the cafeteria as the venue because it provided the largest possible audience for Emma's humiliation and because the public nature of the space would make it difficult for Emma to escape or avoid the confrontation. The timing had been carefully coordinated to occur during the peak lunch period when the maximum number of students would be present to witness Emma's defeat and submission. The psychological significance of the attack on Emma's lunch had been carefully calculated by Ashley, who had observed Emma's daily routine and recognized the emotional importance of the meal her family prepared for her each day. Ashley understood that destroying something connected to Emma's family relationships would be particularly devastating and would demonstrate the reach of their power into even the most personal aspects of Emma's life. The decision to spit on the food had been intended as the ultimate expression of contempt and dominance, a gesture so degrading and personally violating that it would force Emma to either submit completely or expose herself to even more severe consequences through futile resistance. What Ashley, Jake, and Madison had failed to understand was that their carefully planned escalation had actually been providing Emma with extensive practice in applying the psychological conditioning she had received during her military training. Each incident had strengthened her situational awareness, refined her threat assessment capabilities, and reinforced her understanding of the strategic principles that governed conflict resolution. Rather than breaking down her resistance, the harassment campaign had been systematically preparing her for the moment when decisive action would become not just appropriate, but necessary. The confrontation that was about to unfold would expose the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed Ashley's campaign from the beginning. They had assumed that Emma's restraint was evidence of weakness and submission, when it was actually evidence of discipline and strategic thinking. They had interpreted her peaceful approach as fear of conflict, when it was actually respect for the devastating consequences that would follow if she were forced to abandon her commitment to nonviolence. Most critically, they had failed to recognize that military training was not just about physical techniques and tactical knowledge, but about developing the mental preparation and emotional control necessary to respond to threats with appropriate and proportional force. The spitting incident would serve as the trigger that finally released Emma from her self-imposed constraints and demonstrated the difference between genuine strength and the illusion of power created by social privilege and institutional protection. In the seconds that followed Ashley's ultimate act of disrespect, years of military conditioning would assert themselves with devastating effectiveness, transforming the quiet transfer student into a force that none of her tormentors had imagined or prepared for. The social hierarchy that Ashley had worked so carefully to establish would be shattered in an instant, replaced by a new understanding of what real power looked like when it was wielded by someone who had been trained to use it responsibly and effectively. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would become legendary within the halls of Clearwater High School, a moment that would be captured on dozens of cell phone cameras and shared across social media platforms around the world. But more than just a viral moment, it would represent a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that had governed teenage social interaction, a demonstration that systematic harassment and abuse would ultimately be met with consequences that reflected the true capabilities of those who had been underestimated and dismissed by their tormentors. The Friday that would forever change the social landscape of Clearwater High School had begun with an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to crackle through the hallways like electricity before a thunderstorm. Emma Rodriguez had awakened that morning with an unusual sense of clarity and purpose, though she couldn't have articulated exactly what was different about her mental state. Her military training had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a situation was approaching a critical threshold, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that the careful balance she had maintained for months was about to shift dramatically. Emma's morning routine had proceeded with the same methodical precision that characterized all of her daily activities, but there had been an underlying tension that reflected her subconscious preparation for conflict. She had dressed with particular care, ensuring that her uniform was perfectly pressed and that every aspect of her appearance reflected the military bearing she had learned to suppress during her months at Clearwater High School. Her backpack had been packed with the systematic efficiency of someone preparing for a mission, every item checked and rechecked to ensure optimal organization and accessibility. The breakfast conversation with her parents had been more meaningful than usual, though none of them had explicitly acknowledged the significance of what was being discussed. Carlos Rodriguez had shared stories about his early military experiences and the lessons he had learned about standing up for principles, even when the personal cost was high. Rosa Rodriguez had spoken about the importance of maintaining dignity and self-respect even in the face of adversity and injustice. Both parents had seemed to sense that their daughter was approaching a moment of decision that would define her character and her future relationships with authority and conflict. Emma's phone call with Miguel the night before had been particularly significant, though the conversation had been conducted in the careful coded language that military families often used when discussing sensitive topics over potentially monitored communications. Miguel had shared recent experiences from his deployment that emphasized the importance of knowing when to show restraint and when to take decisive action. His stories had contained subtle lessons about the difference between avoiding conflict out of fear and choosing peace from a position of strength, concepts that had resonated deeply with Emma's current situation. The academic portion of Emma's day had proceeded normally, with her teachers noting nothing unusual about her demeanor or performance during morning classes. Mrs. Foster had been impressed by Emma's particularly insightful contributions to their discussion of literary themes involving justice and moral courage. Though she had interpreted Emma's engagement as simple academic interest rather than personal relevance, Mr. Kim had noted that Emma's laboratory work demonstrated even more precision and focus than usual, but he had attributed this to her naturally methodical approach to scientific procedures. The lunch period at Clearwater High School typically began at 11:30 a.m., with students flowing into the large cafeteria complex in waves determined by their class schedules and social affiliations. Emma had maintained her routine of arriving early to claim her corner table near the windows, a location that provided both natural light and strategic advantages in terms of situational awareness and potential escape routes. Her lunch had been prepared with special care by her mother, who had included several of Emma's favorite items, along with a handwritten note expressing love and encouragement. The meal itself had consisted of a carefully constructed turkey and avocado sandwich on homemade bread, a selection of fresh fruit that had been chosen for both nutritional value and visual appeal, and a container of chocolate chip cookies that represented a family recipe passed down through 3 generations of Rodriguez women. Emma had also brought a thermos containing a special blend of chai tea that her grandmother had taught her to prepare, a connection to family tradition that had become increasingly important as she navigated the challenges of her new environment. Ashley Parker's approach to the cafeteria that Friday had been deliberately choreographed as the culminating performance of her months-long campaign against Emma Rodriguez. She had spent the previous evening coordinating with Jake Morrison and Madison Chun to ensure that their final assault would be perfectly timed and executed for maximum psychological impact. Ashley understood that this confrontation would either establish her complete dominance over Emma or potentially escalate into a conflict that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. But her confidence in her own social power had convinced her that Emma would ultimately submit rather than risk further escalation. The timing of the attack had been calculated to coincide with the peak lunch period, when the maximum number of students would be present to witness Emma's humiliation and Ashley's demonstration of power. Ashley had also ensured that several of her allies would be positioned strategically throughout the cafeteria to record the incident and control the narrative that would emerge on social media platforms. The goal was not simply to humiliate Emma in the moment, but to create a permanent record of her defeat that would establish Ashley's reputation and serve as a warning to other students who might consider challenging her authority. Jake Morrison's role in the planned confrontation had been primarily focused on physical intimidation and crowd control, using his imposing presence to prevent Emma from escaping the situation and to discourage other students from intervening on her behalf. Jake had positioned himself near the main exit from the cafeteria, creating a psychological barrier that would make Emma feel trapped and helpless. His instructions had been to escalate the physical intimidation gradually, using his size and reputation to create fear without crossing obvious lines that might trigger immediate administrative intervention. Madison Chun's contributions to the final assault had been characteristically subtle and sophisticated, focusing on psychological warfare and information management rather than direct confrontation. Madison had spent the morning spreading carefully crafted rumors about Emma's family situation and mental health status, creating a narrative framework that would explain and justify whatever humiliation Ashley chose to inflict. Madison had also prepared contingency plans for managing the social media response to the incident, including pre-written posts that would frame the confrontation as justified consequences for Emma's antisocial behavior and inability to integrate into the school community. The moment of confrontation had arrived with the theatrical precision that Ashley had intended, as she led her small entourage across the crowded cafeteria toward Emma's isolated corner table. The conversation volume in the immediate area had decreased noticeably as students recognized the signs of impending drama and positioned themselves to observe the spectacle that was about to unfold. Some students had begun discreetly activating their phone cameras, anticipating that whatever happened next would be worth recording and sharing across their social networks. Emma's recognition of the approaching threat had been immediate and instinctive, her military training automatically assessing the tactical situation and calculating potential responses, even as her conscious mind remained focused on maintaining her commitment to peaceful conflict resolution. Her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly into a more balanced and alert position, though she had continued eating her lunch and avoided making direct eye contact that might be interpreted as a challenge or invitation for escalation. Ashley's opening verbal assault had been designed to create maximum psychological pressure while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Her comments about Emma's social isolation and family background had been delivered in a tone of false concern that made them seem like helpful observations rather than deliberate attacks. The sophisticated nature of this approach had made it difficult for potential witnesses to recognize the harassment for what it was, while also making it nearly impossible for Emma to respond effectively without appearing defensive or unstable. The escalation to physical destruction of Emma's lunch had represented Ashley's decision to abandon subtlety in favor of unmistakable dominance demonstration. The act of grabbing Emma's tray and dumping its contents onto the floor had been intended not just as material destruction, but as a symbolic gesture that established Ashley's power to destroy anything that brought Emma comfort or connection to her family. The scattered food and broken thermos had created a visible representation of Emma's vulnerability and Ashley's willingness to cross traditional boundaries of civilized behavior. The ultimate act of spitting on the destroyed food had been Ashley's most calculated and significant miscalculation. This gesture had been intended as the definitive expression of contempt and dominance, an act so degrading and personally violating that it would force Emma into complete submission while demonstrating to all observers that Ashley possessed the power to humiliate anyone with complete impunity. The psychological significance of this act had been carefully considered by Ashley, who understood that saliva represented one of the most intimate and disgusting forms of bodily contamination that could be inflicted on another person. What Ashley had failed to understand was that this final act of degradation had crossed a threshold that activated Emma's military conditioning in ways that her months of restraint had actually been preparing for rather than suppressing. The sight of her family's carefully prepared food being contaminated with Ashley's saliva had triggered recognition patterns that Emma's training had established for identifying threats that required immediate and decisive response. In that instant, Emma's conscious commitment to peaceful resolution had been overridden by deeper conditioning that classified the situation as requiring defensive action. The transformation that occurred in Emma's demeanor and physical presence had been immediately visible to every student in the surrounding area, though few of them possessed the experience necessary to understand what they were witnessing. Emma's posture had shifted from defensive vulnerability to balanced readiness. Her breathing had become controlled and systematic, and her facial expression had changed from hurt confusion to calm assessment of tactical options. The change had been so dramatic and unmistakable that even students who had never paid attention to Emma before had found themselves staring at her, with sudden recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Emma's verbal response to Ashley's ultimate provocation had been delivered in a tone of voice that carried undertones of authority and controlled power that none of her classmates had ever heard from her before. Her words had been carefully chosen to establish clear boundaries while also providing Ashley with an opportunity to de-escalate the situation before it progressed to physical confrontation. The military bearing that Emma had been suppressing for months had emerged fully in her speech patterns and body language, creating an impression of competence and capability that was completely at odds with the vulnerable victim persona that Ashley had been attacking. Ashley's inability to recognize or appropriately respond to the warning signs in Emma's transformation had been the critical factor that escalated the situation beyond the point of peaceful resolution. Ashley's social conditioning had taught her that victims of harassment would either submit completely or respond with emotional outbursts that could be easily dismissed and punished by authority figures. She had no framework for understanding or responding to someone who possessed genuine capability and training, and her decision to continue pressing the attack had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of what she was now facing. Jake Morrison's decision to intervene physically in support of Ashley had been the trigger that finally released Emma from any remaining constraints about using her military training in civilian social situations. His movement toward Emma had been interpreted by her conditioning as escalation to physical threat level, activating defensive protocols that had been drilled into her through hundreds of hours of realistic combat training. The transition from verbal de-escalation to physical defensive action had been instantaneous and automatic, with Emma's conscious decision-making process completely subordinated to training that prioritized effective threat neutralization. The hip throw that Emma had executed on Jake Morrison had been a textbook demonstration of leverage, timing, and body mechanics that would have been impressive even in a controlled training environment. The technique had utilized Jake's forward momentum and superior body weight against him, redirecting his energy in ways that amplified the force of his impact with the cafeteria floor. The execution had been so smooth and efficient that most observers had been unable to follow the specific movements that had resulted in the massive linebacker being sent crashing to the ground with devastating effectiveness. The immediate aftermath of Jake's takedown had created a moment of stunned silence throughout the cafeteria as students processed what they had just witnessed. The quiet transfer student who had been the target of months of harassment had just demonstrated capabilities that none of them had imagined she possessed. The casual efficiency with which Emma had neutralized someone twice her size had fundamentally altered every observer's understanding of the social dynamics they had been witnessing, forcing them to reconsider assumptions about power, vulnerability, and the consequences of systematic bullying. Emma's positioning after the initial takedown had reflected her training in multiple opponent scenarios and crowd control techniques. She had maintained visual contact with both Ashley and Madison, while keeping Jake within her peripheral vision as he struggled to recover from his unexpected encounter with the floor. Her stance had been balanced and ready for further action, while also projecting controlled confidence that discouraged additional aggression from potential threats. The transformation from victim to protector had been so complete that even students who had never spoken to Emma found themselves feeling safer in her presence. Ashley's psychological response to witnessing Jake's defeat had been characterized by shock, fear, and desperate attempts to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage or understand. Her worldview had been constructed around the assumption that social privilege and institutional protection would always be sufficient to maintain her dominance over other students. The demonstration that physical capability and proper training could override social advantages had shattered her confidence and forced her to confront the possibility that her actions might have consequences she was not prepared to handle. Madison Chun's reaction had been more analytically focused, as her strategic mind had immediately begun calculating the potential ramifications of what she was witnessing for her own reputation and future prospects. Madison understood that the social media documentation of these events would create a permanent record that could affect college applications, family relationships, and long-term social standing. Her priority had shifted from supporting Ashley's dominance display to damage control and reputation management, though she was beginning to realize that the situation had progressed beyond the point where her usual manipulation techniques would be effective. The crowd dynamics in the cafeteria had shifted dramatically as students recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented and historically significant for their school community. Cell phone cameras had emerged throughout the space. As students documented every moment of the confrontation, understanding that they were capturing content that would be shared and discussed far beyond the boundaries of Clearwater High School. The social media implications of the incident were already being calculated by students who specialized in viral content creation and digital reputation management. Emma's decision to allow Jake to recover and regain his footing had been a strategic choice that demonstrated both her capability and her restraint to all observers. Her training had taught her that continuing to press an attack against a defeated opponent could escalate a defensive situation into an aggressive assault with serious legal and disciplinary consequences. By giving Jake the opportunity to withdraw from the confrontation, Emma had maintained the moral high ground while also demonstrating that her actions were motivated by self-defense rather than aggression or revenge. Jake's choice to resume his attack despite having been comprehensively defeated had been driven by embarrassment, anger, and a desperate need to salvage his reputation in front of his peers. His second assault had been even more aggressive than his first attempt, but it had also been more predictable and easier for Emma to counter effectively. The wild swing he had thrown would have caused serious injury if it had connected, But Emma's training had taught her to read telegraphed attacks and respond with precise defensive techniques that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. The elbow strike that Emma had delivered to Jake's solar plexus had been calculated to incapacitate him temporarily without causing permanent injury or damage that might result in serious legal consequences for her actions. The technique had been one of the first she had learned during her training at Camp Pendleton, and her execution had been flawless in terms of timing, targeting, and force application. The result had been immediate and decisive, dropping Jake to his knees and eliminating him as a continuing threat, while demonstrating to all observers that Emma's capabilities extended far beyond simple defensive techniques. The wrist control and compliance hold that Emma had applied to Jake during his recovery period had served multiple purposes within the context of the confrontation and its broader implications. The technique had established her complete physical dominance over someone who had been terrorizing other students for months, while also demonstrating the kind of controlled application of force that characterized professional law enforcement and military training. The hold had been painful enough to ensure Jake's compliance, but not severe enough to cause injury, reflecting Emma's understanding of appropriate force escalation and legal liability issues. Emma's verbal address to the assembled crowd during this phase of the confrontation had been perhaps the most significant aspect of the entire incident in terms of its long-term impact on school culture and social dynamics. Her words had articulated concepts about bullying, bystander responsibility, and institutional failure that many students had been thinking, but had never heard expressed with such clarity and authority. The speech had transformed the incident from a simple physical altercation into an educational moment that challenged fundamental assumptions about how power should be exercised and how communities should respond to systematic harassment. The release of Jake from the compliance hold had been timed to coincide with Emma's transition from physical demonstration to verbal education, allowing her to shift the focus of the confrontation from individual conflict to broader social issues. Her decision to let Jake go had demonstrated that her goals were corrective rather than punitive, focused on changing behavior rather than inflicting punishment. This approach had been consistent with the military leadership principles she had been taught, which emphasized using minimum necessary force to achieve legitimate objectives. Ashley's attempt to regain control of the situation through threats of administrative intervention had represented her inability to adapt to the new reality that Emma's demonstration had created. Her references to calling security and filing reports had reflected her continued belief that institutional authority would support her position and punish Emma for defending herself. Ashley's failure to recognize that the documented evidence would actually support Emma's actions and expose Ashley's own behavior patterns had demonstrated the limitations of her strategic thinking when faced with genuinely unexpected developments. Emma's calm response to Ashley's threats had been designed to educate both Ashley and the observing students about the legal and administrative realities of self-defense situations. Her reference to security footage had been particularly significant because it had demonstrated her understanding of evidence preservation and legal documentation, knowledge that reflected both her military training and her family's experience with official investigations and disciplinary procedures. This response had also served notice to Ashley and her allies that Emma was prepared to defend her actions through official channels if necessary. The systematic humiliation that Emma had delivered to Ashley through their verbal exchange had been far more devastating than any physical assault could have been, because it had exposed Ashley's behavior patterns and psychological motivations to public scrutiny in ways that would have lasting social consequences. Emma's analysis of Ashley's bullying tactics and their underlying psychology had been presented with the clinical precision of someone who had been trained to assess and respond to different types of threats. The education had been delivered in language that was accessible to teenage observers, while also demonstrating sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and conflict resolution. The aftermath of the confrontation had unfolded with the inevitable momentum of a social revolution that had been building pressure for months before finally finding release through Emma's demonstration of capability and leadership. The cell phone videos had begun circulating on social media platforms within minutes of the incident, creating a viral sensation that would ultimately reach millions of viewers and generate discussions about bullying, self-defense, and institutional responsibility in educational settings. The impact had extended far beyond the boundaries of Clearwater High School, influencing policy discussions and educational practices in school districts across the country. The administrative response to the incident had been swift and comprehensive, though the investigation had quickly revealed that Emma's actions had been entirely justified, and that the real problem had been the systematic harassment campaign that Ashley's group had been conducting for months without effective intervention from school authorities. Principal Thompson had found himself forced to confront the institutional failures that had enabled the situation to develop, while also dealing with the public relations implications of having a viral video expose serious deficiencies in his school's anti-bullying policies and enforcement mechanisms. The disciplinary consequences for Ashley, Jake, and Madison had been severe and far-reaching, reflecting both the seriousness of their documented behavior and the public attention that the incident had generated. Ashley had faced suspension from her student government position and removal from the cheerleading squad, consequences that had effectively ended her social dominance at Clearwater High School. Jake had been expelled from the football team and faced potential legal charges for assault, outcomes that had shattered his athletic scholarship prospects and forced him to confront the real-world consequences of his bullying behavior. Madison's punishment had been perhaps the most significant in terms of long-term impact, as her involvement in the systematic harassment campaign had been documented in ways that would affect her college applications and academic reputation. The revelation that someone with her academic credentials and leadership positions had been participating in psychological warfare against a vulnerable student had damaged her credibility with teachers and administrators who had previously viewed her as a model student worthy of recommendations and support. The transformation of school culture at Clearwater High School had been dramatic and lasting, with Emma's demonstration serving as a catalyst for broader changes in how students, faculty, and administrators approached issues of harassment, power dynamics, and community responsibility. The incident had forced everyone associated with the school to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic failures and institutional enablement of harmful behavior. The result had been a comprehensive overhaul of policies, procedures, and cultural norms that had created a safer and more supportive environment for all students. Emma's emergence as a leader and advocate within the school community had been a natural extension of the courage and principle she had demonstrated during the confrontation. Her establishment of support groups for bullying victims and her work with administration to improve reporting and intervention systems had reflected her understanding that lasting change required sustained effort and institutional commitment rather than dramatic individual actions. Her military training had provided her with the leadership skills and systematic thinking necessary to translate her personal victory into broader social progress. The long-term impact of the incident had extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence discussions about youth development, conflict resolution, and institutional responsibility throughout the educational community. Emma's story had become a case study used in anti-bullying training programs and leadership development curricula, demonstrating the importance of teaching young people both self-defense capabilities and the wisdom to use those capabilities responsibly and appropriately. The transformation had been complete, but the mission had evolved rather than ended. Emma Rodriguez had learned that true victory was not measured by the defeat of individual opponents, but by the creation of systems and cultures that protected the vulnerable and held the powerful accountable for their actions. Her military training had given her the tools to defend herself, but it had also given her the understanding that with great capability comes great responsibility to use that capability in service of justice and community welfare. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.